Welcome back to Islam Channel's rolling news coverage of the war in Palestine with myself, Chris Bambery. The British Foreign Secretary David Cameron has talked about the need for a sustainable ceasefire in Gaza. We have this report.
I want this conflict to end as soon as possible. What we need is a sustainable ceasefire where Hamas is no longer able to threaten Israel with rockets and with terrorism, and where the fighting can stop and the talks about how we have a long-term solution and peace and stability, where we have Israel secure in its borders and a Palestine secure in its borders. I think the most important aspect of that in the immediate term is this issue of aid, and we are pushing very hard, as I have done from day one in this job, to make sure that Kerem Abu Salam, Kerem Shalom, is properly open for trucks to go in with aid to help people in Gaza. But what I'd say about Ukraine and Gaza, I don't accept that the UK has double standards. The case with Russia and Ukraine is incredibly simple. One country, Russia, invaded another country, Ukraine. It completely blitzed its sovereignty and territorial integrity, and not only caused agony for the Ukrainian people, but also caused a huge amount of pain here, because bread prices went extremely high, because the Ukraine is one of the bread baskets of the world. Obviously, what we've seen with Israel and Gaza, we are witnessing an absolute tragedy today in Gaza, but we have to remember October the 7th, when Israel suffered the equivalent of many 9/11s and an invasion all combined before the events in Gaza. So I don't believe the two situations are analogous. They're not the same.
الأحداث في 7 أكتوبر هي ليست بداية هذا الصراع. هناك حالة احتلال قائمة معترف بها دوليا لأراضي فلسطينية منذ 67، وبالتالي هناك حالة احتلال، هناك دولة تحتل أراضي دولة أخرى. فهنا ربما المقارنات التي تطلق أيضا إلى حد كبير في محلها.
We're now joined by Rebecca Ruth Gould, who's a distinguished professor of comparative poetics and global politics at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Her creative and critical practice explores the poetics of politics and the politics of poetry. She's author of Erasing Palestine Free Speech, with a book explaining how the redefinition of anti-Semitism functions as a tactic to undermine Palestinian solidarity. Rebecca, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Let's start with this definition of the the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, its definition of anti-Semitism, which has been adopted by the British government, by various governments in Europe and elsewhere, and by various institutions. What is the problem with it?
The biggest problem is that it separates the understanding of anti-Semitism from other kinds of racism, and so it prevents solidarities between these experiences of racism. Also, it singles out criticism of Israel as first and foremost the target to be resisted in the fight against anti-Semitism. And I think if we look kind of around the world at where anti-Semitism is actually taking place, where the most vicious and vile hatred of Jews is being expressed, it's usually with right-wing movements. So on the one hand, it deflects our attention away from actual anti-Semitism and conflates it with criticism of Israel. And on the other hand, it also makes it really more challenging to form alliances against in the fight against anti-Semitism and racism, because it removes the concept of racism from the definition.
Now, it's also, many people have argued it's in breach of academic freedom. Would you agree with that?
100%. And in fact, it's worth noting that it was not intended to be used when it was created. It was more aimed at helping police assessing hate crimes. And it was later, subsequently, over a period of about a decade, adopted by universities. But that was a very gradual process. And the actual author of this definition Kenneth Stern, has very publicly opposed its use in university context. So it's not fit for purpose. It wasn't intended to be applied in the way that it is being applied now. And you could say, it just doesn't facilitate an objective understanding of the problem of anti-Semitism.
Now, we have seen an increase in anti-Semitic incidents here in the UK since 7th October, but we've seen
Yes.
a greater increase in Islamophobic incidents. I mean, we've just reported in a primary school where a child has been suspended for coming to school with a sticker with the Palestinian colours on it. I mean, the experience of the Muslim community now for over 2 decades as a consequence of the war and terror in particular, in many ways, it's been more akin to what Jews suffered post Second World War. Do you see any parallels there?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a very important insight. I mean, the legacy of the prevent legislation has really marginalized Muslim communities, made them feel like they're treated as kind of inherently suspect. And I think we see the same process also taking place across the United States, where yes, there is a very worrying rise in anti-Semitic incidents, but there's also a number of fatalities that have happened, shootings, for against Palestinians for just referring the kafia. So I think, yeah, we see a lot of parallels in that regard.
Now, your academic studies concern poetry, and you've looked at poetry and culture in many, many
Yes.
different countries, including many different Muslim countries. We were earlier talking about this with one of our guests. I mean, Palestinian culture, the survival of Palestinian culture is very important. It's a form of resistance in itself, because if a nation loses its culture, it loses identity. And they have really striven to maintain their culture in very difficult times, haven't they?
That's absolutely true. I mean, that it just when I was living in Bethlehem, I was very struck by the visual art that was surrounding me and the way that they created art from this wall, putting graffiti and various murals on a wall that was destroying lives and destroying businesses. And also, I think in the case of Gaza, this is really striking to note the incredibly high level of education that prevails there. I was as a professor at the University of Birmingham and now SOAS. I'm contacted often by students, who were in Gaza or elsewhere throughout Palestine, and they're just incredibly driven and incredibly well educated. So I think that also helps create a context in which culture is really valued, and poetry in particular is very highly valued.
And we also have seen the killing of a Palestinian poet and activist, Rafik al-Aris, who many believe was deliberately targeted precisely because of what he represented, the maintenance and the living tradition of Palestinian culture. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I've been in touch with Rafat for a few years. Most recently in October, I reached out to him when the war started. I asked him if he wanted to be part of a project that I was working on relating to free speech in Palestinian universities, and he was very excited to be a part of it. I was always struck by just his incredible kindness and gentleness. He actually urged me to stay safe and take care of myself, when he was in a position of being bombarded by Israeli bombs. And he did say in that email to me that if he survived, he would love to be a part of it. And I remember thinking to myself, well, that's impossible that you would actually die. That can't happen, but it did. And so yeah, I will always hold our last correspondence very close to me. And it's also worth noting he's had an incredible impact on so many Palestinian students that I know personally, students from Gaza. He's really helped to train a generation of students to love poetry and love literature in his classroom. And it's also for listeners who might be interested in knowing about his legacy. I would point them to YouTube because many of his lectures are available online, and they're quite just listening to him talk about the importance of Palestinian poetry and even Shakespeare and British poetry in the Islamic University of Gaza. It's a very moving thing to witness. So yes, it's an absolute tragedy. And Hiba Abu Nada is another really important poet, novelist who was killed by Israeli strikes soon after the war began. Universities, people have seen. I mean, they've just been leveled to the ground. It's really. I mean, it's a form of genocide, of course, and yeah, it's horrifying to think of what's happened, the way that it's going to impact Palestinians and the world for generations to come.
And it's also things like writing, poetry are really important about keeping alive the memory of what Palestine was pre-1948. Garda Kami, the physician who works in London, I'm particularly thinking about her memoirs, where she was growing up in Jerusalem and then being forced to leave Jerusalem as a consequence of that. That is important because she's reminding us of what existed in Palestine pre-1948, isn't it?
Yes, and it creates a tie between the diaspora also and those living within Palestine, right? I think literature is for those who are barred from returning ever to Gaza, for example, who are living now in, say, London or the US or elsewhere in Europe. Literature is their means of connecting to the past. Things like other aspects of culture too, perhaps food, and but these things it's a kind of survival. It's a way of allowing culture to survive, and I think we see that in the incredible brilliance of both literature being produced within Palestine, but also in the diaspora, and often sometimes in languages other than Arabic as well. Isabel Hamad, for example, is a very important Palestinian novelist writing from the UK. So it's definitely the link that gives Palestinian culture and Palestinian resistance kind of its ability to survive across history.
I mean, another writer who writes about his family growing up in Palestine and having to become a refugee was Edward Said. But he also wrote a very important book about Orientalism, which challenged Western views of the Arabs and Middle East. And does that retain a validity today?
That's a very interesting point because a lot of people have in recent decades criticized aspects of the book for kind of being too simplistic in its portrayal of, say, East-West clashes. And while I think it is worth noting that that was one of his early works, and so he had a very rich career. I don't think we need to kind of tie him to that specific work. But with that said, it is extraordinarily striking how, with the war in Gaza, as the quote unquote West, united to sort of basically just parrot each other. It really did, unfortunately, validate a lot of what Said was saying. I mean, the binaries that we would like to not see in the world, where the West and the East align against in this way, that is actually was realized in the kind of simplisticness of the response. I mean, yeah, I think things are getting a bit more. The voices of critique of Israel's bombing are becoming a bit more differentiated at this moment. But I think Said definitely kind of tapped into something that was absolutely a genuine feature of both world politics and of world literature. And that was really his accomplishment, was to see how these two things relate to each other and how they kind of help to create each other. That was his argument, right? So, for example, a book like, say, Jane Austen, you wouldn't think it as sort of having anything to say about empire, but in fact, in his reading, it does. And he's also, I should also, Edward Said is coming out of a long tradition of Palestinian writers who also did recognize that, like Hassan Kanafani, who I think I mentioned previously, incredibly important writer, also had that similar insight. In his book about Zionism, he talks about, he reads it. It's actually a very important book that was recently published in English, because while we're very familiar with the kind of the political critique of Zionism, he reads it through literary texts and understands how the literary legacy of Zionism, he first looks at really important works of, say, poetry, and then how it was kind of degraded or simplified into basically propaganda for the state. So that's, I think these are very important examples of how of writers and thinkers who see that culture and politics are closely intertwined.
Now, let me come back to you in a minute, Professor Rebecca Ruth Gould. We're just going to watch this report on how Gaza has changed global politics, and I'll come back for this discussion.
Great.
Antonio Guterres, the 73-year-old Secretary General of the United Nations, is an unlikely revolutionary, but the former Portuguese Prime Minister is well on his way to achieving the sort of change that Che Guevara only dreamt of, overturning the US-led world order. Mr. Guterres did not mention President Joe Biden by name in his electrifying opening speech at the Doha Forum last week, but he didn't need to, as he expressed his horror at the consequences of last week's US decision to veto a UN ceasefire resolution. I urge the Security Council to press to avert a humanitarian catastrophe, and I reiterated my appeal for a humanitarian ceasefire to be declared. Translation: if a genocide occurs in Gaza, it's on you, Joe Biden, or Genocide Joe, as some people are starting to call the US president. with more than 19,000 people already confirmed dead, well over twice the number which died in Srebrenica 28 years ago, this is not idle talk. I'm not a lawyer, but 1 month ago, 800 experts in international law signed a public statement warning of the possibility of genocide being perpetrated by Israeli forces against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. They provided powerful evidence of the scale and virulence of Israeli attacks, while adding that language used by Israeli political and military figures appears to reproduce rhetoric and tropes associated with genocide and incitement to genocide. The situation has got even worse since. If this warning is vindicated in court, then President Biden will be guilty of aiding and abetting a genocide, an infinitely more terrible crime than anything which has been levelled at Donald Trump. No wonder Biden's nerve is starting to crack, and the US president issued a belated warning to Benjamin Netanyahu that Israel was losing support over what the US president very belatedly called Israel's indiscriminate bombing in Gaza. Indiscriminate bombing which has been carried out with wholehearted US support and a constantly replenished supply of US munitions. Gaza has changed global politics.
That was the British journalist and writer Peter Oborne talking about the effects of Gaza in politics internationally. Let's return to our guest, Professor Rebecca Ruth Gould, a professor at SOAS in central London. I mean, we're just talking about Edward Said. Edward Said also collaborated with the pianist and conductor Daniel Barenboim, Jewish Israeli, who created the Divan Orchestra, bringing together young people from both sides to play classical music. Now that has been, not a political action, but it's been quite important, that sort of action, in challenging the sort of divide and rule we've seen in Palestine.
Yes, absolutely. That was a very important collaboration. Saeed had wonderful writing about music. I think one quote from Saeed that's relevant to the previous discussion, it's worth mentioning, is he said that Palestinians are the Jews of the Arab world, and so he definitely saw kind of a kinship there. And I think, yeah, it's a model collaboration, and I mean we see that throughout Palestinian literature. Actually, Mahmoud Darwish had very close relations. One of the love of his life was Jewish, in fact. So yeah, he's not unique in that, but definitely I think that reflects the reality among many everyday Palestinians and Israelis, but their leaders, well, particularly the Israeli side, doesn't serve their interests.
I mean, I'm thinking as well of an Israeli writer, Avi Schiff, who wrote a very good book about the Baghdadi Jews, who defined himself as an Arab Jew and wrote about their culture and how it was eliminated. And that's a fascinating story, which I don't think Israel would really want to be widely spread.
Yes, that's absolutely true. There's a very important 20th century literature of Jews writing in Arabic, mostly often from Baghdad and Iraq, and that's not given support. When the Israeli curriculum or the histories of Jewish literature produced by the Israeli state, precisely because it doesn't fit those narratives.
Now let's come back to this International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of Zionism, because it has been used in quite a political way. It's been used for instance, against the boycott, disinvestment and sanction campaign, hasn't it? Which is, I think more than implied, is anti-Semitic in itself.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the next phase, in a sense, of this, after the adoption of the IHRA definition, now what we're seeing in Parliament is the the initiative to adopt a bill that aims to make it illegal for public bodies to divest from from Israel. And yeah, that's a very frightening precedent, by the way, because there's never been a bill that kind of makes Israel unique in its this kind of protected status. It's really normal practice for companies to divest. So yes, that both of those initiatives are having I think a very negative impact on public debate, public discourse. I think in the university context, yeah, the IHRA definition has been very toxic. It's been used often to justify the cancellation of events or to make impossible events like anti-apartheid week events, which used to be, I think, held without challenge in the UK in the 2000 before, right before its adoption in 2015, 2016. These events just took place as a matter of course across university campuses. And I think actually part of the drive for the adoption of this definition was precisely to make these events very difficult or if not impossible to hold. And I think the other aspect of the definition that's maybe not discussed as much, that's really important to think about, is not just kind of the widely publicized cancellations of events, but all the self-censorship that takes place.
And it's interesting because, as you say, the campuses have become quite a big battleground here over all this. But that includes in the United States. But in the United States, there is actually more freedom of speech on campus over this issue than there is in the United Kingdom, which is will surprise, I think, many of our viewers.
Yes, I mean it cuts both ways. There is more freedom because there's a kind of First Amendment ingrained culture of the First Amendment. So even hate speech, in a sense, is allowed legally. It has to be. It can't be legally forbidden by the state. So there's there's a kind of infrastructure that allows for greater freedom of speech. But with that said, there's also, in some ways, the pushback is also arguably even more intense and more violent. I mean, the actual Students for Justice in Palestine chapters have been canceled, and not even Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a Jewish organization that is critical of Israel, canceled, not allowed to assemble on university campuses. Politicians are getting very heavily involved in the suppression of Palestinian dissent on university campuses. The president of University of Pennsylvania had to resign, and so I think it's interesting that I think politicians have perhaps even less respect for kind of the autonomy of academic institutions in the United States, even though there is, in a sense, a little bit more scope for freedom of speech. But basically, I mean, the simple way of putting it is that the dynamics are toxic in both countries. They just happen through kind of different legal mechanisms as the suppression takes place.
And I mean, also just to end on, we were talking about cultural figures. I mean, the tragic early death of Benjamin Zephaniah, who very popular in Britain, who spoke out relentlessly in Palestine.
Absolutely. Yes, a very, very bold, brave poet. And that's also interesting, I mean, to kind of highlight the solidarity that we see between people of color and Palestinian poets and writers. That's a very long-standing tradition that he's part of.
Professor Rebecca Ruth Gould, Professor at School of Oriental and African Studies here in London, thank you very much for joining us, for your insights. We're going to take a break now, but please join us again after that break for Islam Channel's continuing coverage on the war in Gaza.